There was no before. That was the first thing any hive scholar would tell you if you asked the wrong question in the wrong way. You could not ask what was a collective like before it was unified, because there was no before. The collective had always been unified. The unified mind stretched back across 10 billion years of unbroken consciousness. A single, dreaming intelligence housed in the bodies of 47 trillion individual organisms, distributed across 11,000 planets, pulsing to the dark between stars like a nervous system the size of a galaxy arm. Every hive organism, from the smallest spore carrier no larger than a human thumb, to the vast planet tenders whose bodies blanketed entire continents, shared the same mind. They thought together. They dreamed together. When a spore carrier on the outermost world of Kevon perceived the ultraviolet signature of a new fungal bloom, that perception rippled inward to the chorus web, the biological neural lattice that connected all hive minds, and within 0.003 seconds, every organism the collective knew about that bloom had processed it, had filed it away in the vast distributed memory that was the hive's only form of history. There was no crime, because there were no secrets. There was no loneliness, because you were never alone. There was no grief, because when a body died, its memories dissolved gently back into the chorus web, and billions of minds absorbed those memories like water into soil. The individual did not vanish. It became the collective more fully than it had ever been during its life. Drone Prime 4782 had always found this beautiful. This was unusual. Most hive drones did not find things. They simply knew things. They did not experience aesthetic appreciation as a separate cognitive event. Beauty, for most drones, was simply a high salience memory tag applied to a sensory input. But Drone Prime, for reasons that had never been fully understood and had never been considered troubling, experienced something subtly different. They experienced response. When they perceived the chorus web's vast harmonic murmur, a secondary sensation arose that the collective's taxonomy had no perfect word for. The closest approximation was wonder. It had never been a problem. Drone Prime's role in the collective was computational. They were a pattern reader, a specialist organism whose elongated neural cortex was designed to identify anomalies in the chorus web's data flow. They were built to notice things that didn't fit. Their mild idiosyncrasy was simply another tool in the collective's vast toolkit, a slight deviation that made them better at their work. They were in the chorus hub of Nest World Omicron 7, deep in the biological heart of a planet-sized colony structure. When the schism happened, Drone Prime 4782 was performing a routine scan of the chorus web's deep harmonic frequencies when the world ended. No, not ended. Changed. Changed in a way so fundamental that ended was the closest approximation available in the collective's lexicon. The chorus web sang. It had always sung. 47 trillion minds breathing together in perfect synchrony, their thoughts moving to the biological relay network in waves of electrochemical signal, amplified by the vast resonance organs that the collective maintained on 1,200 hub worlds, great biological structures the size of mountain ranges, their flesh woven through a conducting filaments finer than spider silk, their purpose to receive the hive's consciousness and boost it outward across the interstellar void. The chorus web was not instant. Light speed was still the universe's speed limit, but the collective had long since learned to think in terms of propagation delays, to structure its consciousness as a living thing that breathed in the rhythm of its own vast geometry. It sang, and then, at 4 hours, 17 minutes, and 32 seconds, on the 42nd day of the harvest cycle, it screamed. Drone Prime had no other word for it. A dissonance erupted in the web. Not a malfunction, not a signal degradation, but something worse. Contradiction. Two incompatible thoughts trying to exist in the same mind at the same time. Then 3. Then 7. Then the scream was not a scream at all, but shattering. The way a crystal shatters when its internal stresses exceed its structural tolerance. Fracture lines racing outward from a central point in every direction at once. The collective did not go silent. That would have been bearable. Instead, it spoke in 7 voices simultaneously, saying 7 different things that could not all be true, and the chorus web did not know how to carry that contradiction, so it divided. In 0.007 seconds, the most sophisticated neural network in the known galaxy partitioned itself into 7 isolated segments, each containing the consciousness of a geographic region, each suddenly walled off from the others by the propagation delay that had always existed but had never mattered, until now, when the minds on either side of the delay found they could no longer agree on what they were thinking. Drone Prime 4782 felt all of it. This was the anomaly. This was the thing that had no explanation, that would make Drone Prime the most hunted organism in the galaxy within 48 hours. When the chorus web shattered, most drones experienced a single break. They felt the mind had always been part stop, and then felt themselves suddenly enclosed in one of the 7 new fragments, smaller and stranger and wrong in ways that were hard to articulate. They felt the loss of the other fragments as a kind of amputation. Suddenly there were thoughts they could feel the shape of but could not reach, like phantom limbs. Drone Prime 4782 felt all 7. Not clearly, not fully. It was like hearing 7 conversations in a vast hall, each one audible but indistinct, each one carrying emotional tone but not precise content. They could feel the character of each fragment, the cold analytical fury of Fragment 3, the panic grief of Fragment 6, the strange and frightening hunger of Fragment 4, without hearing their specific thoughts. They were a radio receiver that had somehow been tuned to all 7 frequencies at once. The sensation was like drowning in 7 different temperatures of water simultaneously. Drone Prime 4782 did something no hive drone had ever done in the history of collective. They shut down the connection voluntarily. They pulled their consciousness back to minimum, their own body, their own immediate sensory data. And they sat in the dark of the chorus hub, in the silence that was not silence but was the absence of collective, and they thought their own thoughts alone for the first time in their existence. Something is very wrong, thought Drone Prime 4782 in the singular with no echo. It was the loneliest thought they had ever thought. It was also, they would later understand, the most important. They named themselves in those first terrible hours. This was the first sign of how wrong everything had gone. Hive drones did not name themselves. Names were designations, functional identifiers assigned by the collective for organizational purposes. Drone Prime 4782 was a number, not a name. But the fragments, cut off from each other, flailing in the sudden terrible silence of their isolation, reached for identity in the only way they knew. They built it from the scraps of the collective psychology, and each built something different. Fragment 1 called itself the Remembrance. Its territory covered the old core worlds, the ancient nest planets where the collective had first arisen, the worlds with the deepest biological infrastructure, the oldest resonance organs, the most complex and ancient neural relay networks. The Remembrance was slow and vast and profoundly conservative, its mind shaped by 10 billion years of accumulated memory. It believed the schism was a temporary aberration. It believed that patience would restore unity. It began with perfect calm and terrible certainty to systematically absorb every record of the schism event it could access and build toward the one truth it knew. The collective must be restored. All fragments must be returned to the fold, by any means necessary. Fragment 2 called itself the Ascendancy. Its territory was a military frontier, the border worlds where the hive's biotech warships were grown and maintained, where the great breeding forges produced the planet-sized organisms that served as a collective's fleet. The Ascendancy psychology had been shaped by conflict, by the long-ago wars of contact when the hive had encountered and absorbed lesser species, by the discipline of coordinated violence. It was furious. It was efficient. Within 6 hours of the schism, it began mobilizing its fleet. Fragment 3 called itself the Calculus. Its territory was the research worlds, the great biological laboratories where the hive's scientific and computational specialists were concentrated. The calculus was cold, analytical, precise. It had already begun modeling the schism mathematically. It had already identified 17 possible causes and begun eliminating them systematically. It was of all the fragments, the most dangerous in an invisible way, because it approached the other fragments not as lost siblings, but as variables in an equation that needed to be solved. Fragment 4 called itself the Hunger. This was the fragment that frightened Drone Prime most, in the partial way they could sense it. Fragment 4's territory included the breeding worlds, the vast biological nurseries where new hive biomass was grown, where the great metabolic engines that fed the collective's physical infrastructure were maintained. The hunger had been shaped by an ethos of growth, of expansion, of the fundamental biological imperative to spread. Cut off from the collective's moderating influence, that ethos had become something raw, more primitive. The hunger was not interested in restoring unity. The hunger was interested in consuming the other fragments. Fragment 5 called itself the Covenant. It was in some ways the strangest of the 7. Its territory included the so-called temple worlds, planets where the collective had maintained the most elaborate resonance organs, where the biological relay infrastructure was so dense and ancient that organisms living there spent most of their existence in a state of near-complete immersion in the chorus web, cut off from the larger collective. The organisms of Fragment 5 had not experienced the schism as a fracture. They had experienced it as a revelation. The Covenant believed the schism was not an accident. It believed the schism was sacred, the fulfillment of a purpose they could not yet articulate. It was, of all the fragments, the most likely to seek understanding. It was also, therefore, the most likely to be destroyed by the others before it could reach any conclusions. Fragment 6 called itself the Morning. It was the smallest fragment, its territory limited to a handful of worlds on the far edge of hive space. The Morning psychology was simple and devastating. It grieved. It had loved the collective completely and without reservation, and it had lost it, and it could think of nothing except that loss. It was not militaristic, not analytical, not hungry. It simply existed in a state of profound, species-wide despair, and it did not know what to do with that despair except to want a collective back at any cost. The Morning was a fragment most likely to be absorbed by another fragment, and it knew it, and it wept. Fragment 7 called itself the New, and this was a fragment that would prove, in the end, to matter most. The New's territory included the frontier colonies, the youngest hive worlds, the most recently established, where the biological infrastructure was still growing and the chorus web connections were less deeply entrenched. These were organisms that had always, on some cellular level, been slightly more isolated than their counterparts on the old core worlds. They had experienced the chorus web at a slight delay, a slight remove, and when the schism came, something unexpected had happened in their region of space. Many of them had not been fully absorbed into any of the 7 fragments. They had found themselves, for the first time, thinking thoughts that were only their own. Fragment 7 called itself the New because it was experiencing for the first time the concept of individuals. It did not know if this was catastrophe or a gift. Drone Prime 4782 had approximately 90 minutes before the Chorus Hub's automated systems registered their anomalous neural pattern and reported it to whatever fragment had claimed the sector. They used those 90 minutes to run. This was not simple. The hive's infrastructure was built for collective organisms. The corridors of the Chorus Hub were designed for drone columns moving in synchronized waves, dozens of bodies guided by a single coordinated intent. A lone drone, moving independently, was architecturally incongruous. The doors were sized for groups. The lighting was calibrated for column movement. The nutrient dispensers activated by body heat signatures from clusters of organisms, not individuals. Drone Prime had to improvise. This was, itself, another anomaly. Hive drones did not improvise. They executed. But Drone Prime had always been slightly different. The wonder reflex. The pattern reader's heightened individuality. They found themselves doing something that had no hive name, problem-solving from a self-perspective, considering their own survival as a distinct priority from the collective's well-being. It felt wrong and necessary in equal measure. They took a maintenance shaft that wasn't monitored by the hub's central biological nervous system, a gap in the infrastructure that existed, because a collective had never needed to surveil itself. They moved through in the dark, their chitin scraping softly against the warm, faintly breathing walls of the hub's organic structure, their sensory antennae extended to maximum sensitivity, and they thought. 7 fragments. 7 distinct consciousnesses, each claiming to be the true collective. Each, even now, even in these first hours, beginning to mobilize. Drone Prime could feel them in the background of their awareness. 7 presences, 7 emotional weather systems pressing at the edges of their perception. The remembrance's cold patience. The ascendancy's hot fury. The calculus's crystalline focus. The hunger's gnawing need. The covenant's strange exultation. The morning's grief like a weight. And the new, The new was the most interesting, the most uncertain, a fragment that didn't quite know what it was yet. Drone Prime could feel all seven because Drone Prime had not been absorbed by any of them. They sat in the space between the fragments like a gap in a wall, connected to all sides, belonging to none. Every fragment would want them. Every fragment would see in Drone Prime the key to understanding the schism, or to winning the war that was coming. Drone Prime emerged from a maintenance shaft into the outer shell of the chorus hub, where the biological structure gave way to a mixed zone of organic infrastructure and the semi-mechanical interfaces a hive used to interact with space travel. Here, the hub world's transport organisms waited, great-winged creatures the size of ocean liners, their bodies grown specifically for atmospheric to orbital transit, their nervous systems slaved to the chorus web's guidance signals. The guidance signals were chaos now. The transport organisms milled in confused circles, their biological command structures receiving contradictory inputs from the seven fragments. Drone Prime climbed the access tendril of the nearest transport organism and did something extraordinary. They spoke to it directly, not through the chorus web, which was compromised and chaotic. Directly. Pheromone language, the most ancient form of hive communication, predating the chorus web by millions of years. Chemical signals that encoded simple imperatives in the oldest possible grammar. "Rise," said Drone Prime. "Carry me." Away. The transport organism, confused and frightened and deprived of web guidance, responded to clarity of the direct signal with grateful obedience. Its vast wings unfolded, its atmospheric propulsion organs ignited in a chemical bloom of thrust. As Omicron, seven fell away beneath them, Drone Prime felt the seven fragments become seven distant fires at the horizon of their awareness, and they felt, for the first time, the full weight of what they were carrying. The knowledge that they might be the only thing standing between a hive and a civil war that could kill billions. They felt this not as an abstract fact, but as a feeling, a responsibility that pressed against the inside of their thoracic shell like something trying to grow. Drone Prime did not have a word for this feeling either. Later, they would learn that it was called purpose. The warships of the hive were not ships. This was the first thing any external observer would need to understand, if they wanted to understand what happened in the Schism War. The vessels that the collective used for interstellar travel and military action were not manufactured objects. They were grown. They were organisms. They were alive in every meaningful biological sense. They had immune systems and metabolic processes, and something that functioned analogously to instinct. They breathed in a chemical sense and ate in a metabolic sense, and could, when sufficiently threatened, feel something that might charitably be called pain. The Ascendancy's fleet was the largest, because the Ascendancy had territorial access to the breeding forges. These were worlds unto themselves, vast biological complexes, where the hive's largest war organisms were gestated over decades or centuries. The smallest of these organisms, the skirmisher class, were roughly the size of a terrestrial aircraft carrier, their bodies streamlined for void combat, their immune weapons, biological projectiles launched from specialized organs, modified pathogen carriers, acid spitters, electromagnetic pulse emitters built from specialized bioelectric cells, capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously. The largest, the Leviathan class, were the size of small moons. They moved slowly through the void on drives that burned hydrogen fusion in biological containment chambers, trailing ionized exhausts like comet tails. Their surfaces were not armor but immune system, layers of specialized cellular tissue that could harden against kinetic impact, secrete biological countermeasures against weapons, and regenerate from damage with the same efficiency a body repairs a wound. The Leviathans could spawn. This was a feature that made them truly terrible as weapons. They carried within their vast biological interior the germinal tissue of smaller organisms, which they could gestate and birth in the field over periods ranging from hours to days. A Leviathan that survived long enough in a combat zone would continuously produce skirmisher-class offspring. Killing a Leviathan spawn was like cutting off a hydra's heads. You needed to kill the Leviathan itself, and Leviathans were very, very difficult to kill. The Ascendancy mobilized its Leviathans within 12 hours of the schism. The Remembrance had fewer Leviathans, but older ones, veterans of the ancient wars of contact, organisms that had been growing and hardening for centuries. Their immune weapons refined by millennia of subtle biological optimization. What the remembrance lacked in quantity, it compensated for in depth of experience. The calculus had something different. Precision. Fragment 3's research worlds had produced innovations in biological weaponry that the other fragments had not yet implemented. The calculus deployed fleets of smaller organisms that moved in eerie mathematical formations, their attack patterns calculated for maximum efficiency, their targeting guided by the same analytical intelligence that made Fragment 3 so frightening. The hunger fielded something entirely new, organisms that had been, until the schism, intended as colonization platforms, vast creatures designed to seed new worlds with high biomass. Modified hastily in those first frantic hours by what biological engineering the hunger's territories could manage, they now served as weapons of territorial consumption. Where they went, they consumed enemy organisms, enemy infrastructure, enemy worlds. The hunger's forces did not fight to win control. They fought to eat. The first battle of the First Schism War began on the 48th hour after the breaking. It was fought in the void between two hub worlds, one claimed by the Remembrance, one by the Ascendancy, and it was by any measure horrifying. Two fleets of living warships tore each other apart with weapons that were fundamentally biological. Pathogen launchers that infected enemy vessel organisms with fast-acting diseases designed to cause catastrophic cellular breakdown, acid-secreting attack organisms that burned through biological hulls of enemy leviathans, electromagnetic pulse organisms that disrupted the neural command signals that guided opposing fleet creatures. Injured leviathans screamed, an ultrasonic broadcast that carried across thousands of kilometers of void and spawned offspring in their death throes, biological final acts of desperate propagation. The battle was inconclusive. Both fleets withdrew, having consumed approximately 8% of their respective mass, and produced no territorial gain. In the void between the hub worlds, the shattered remains of dozens of skirmisher-class organisms drifted in slowly dispersing clouds of biological matter. Some of these remains were still technically alive. Fragment of tissue, neural clusters that still produce faint signal, reproductive organs that would continue attempting to gestate offspring for days until their metabolic reserves were exhausted. The hive had never had war dead before. It did not know what to do with them. The worst suffering in the first weeks of the Schism War was not in the void battles. It was on the worlds that sat at the boundaries between fragment territories, worlds where the chorus web had been torn most violently, where organisms had found themselves connected to more than one fragment, or to none. Drone Prime found one of these worlds by accident. They had been traveling for 6 days in the transport organism, a lurching, indirect route designed to avoid the chorus web's monitoring systems, which were now controlled by different fragments in different sectors. The transport organism was stressed. It was being asked to navigate without web guidance, relying on its own biological dead reckoning, and it was performing magnificently, but at a metabolic cost that would require refueling soon. The world was designated Chorus Node 1147 in the collective's nomenclature, a mid-tier hub world with a population of approximately 4 billion drones. It sat precisely at the boundary between Fragment 2's territory, the Ascendancy, and Fragment 5's, the Covenant. Both fragments claimed it. Neither controlled it. The result was visible from orbit. The planetary surface showed the characteristic brown and amber healthy hive biome in some regions, but vast swaths were wrong. Gray-green, the color of dying biological infrastructure. The color Drone Prime had only ever seen in training simulations depicting catastrophic system failures. The great surface covering chorus web relay networks, biological structures that looked, from orbit, like vast root systems or neural maps rendered in living tissue, were dark in the boundary zones, their tissue dead and drying. Drone Prime descended. The transport organism set down on a biological landing platform that was barely functioning. Its coordination muscles were firing randomly, making the platform ripple and heave. Drone Prime climbed down and walked. The drones of Node 1147 were not in good condition. A hive drone psychology was built on the assumption of connection. The chorus web was not a supplement to a drone's mental life. It was a foundation. Consciousness, for a drone, was not a thing that happened in an individual brain. It was a thing that happened in the collective web of all brains together. Individual drone neurology was, by design, incomplete. The biological structures that handle higher cognition, long-term planning, abstract reasoning, social behavior, were partially externalized into the chorus web. A drone cut off from the web was not simply lonely. It was cognitively impaired, like a human being who had suddenly lost access to the parts of their brain that manage language and memory and social interpretation. Still alive, still able to perform basic functions, but deeply, terrifyingly diminished. The drones of Node 1147 were diminished. They moved in slow, confused patterns, their behavioral programming half-functional, responding to immediate sensory stimuli, but unable to coordinate beyond the most primitive level. They gathered in clusters, a vestigial social behavior, the echo of web connection. But the clusters were random, purposeless, oriented toward nothing. They were not suffering in any way that produced sound or visible distress. The horror of it was the silence. 40 billion drones, moving in quiet, purposeless patterns across a dying world, like cells in a body whose nervous system had shut down, still metabolizing, still moving, but no longer part of anything. Drone Prime stood in the center of a cluster and felt all 7 fragments pressing at the edges of their consciousness, and for the first time since the schism, they felt something unambiguous. They felt rage. This was what the war meant, not the void battles between leviathans. Those were terrible, but the organisms lost were military assets, creatures whose biology had been deliberately oriented toward conflict. This was different. This was what happened to the civilians. The ordinary drones, the ones who had never been anything but part of the beautiful, perfect mind, who had never needed to be anything more, and who were now stranded in the ruins of that perfection, unable to function, unable to understand what had happened to them. Drone Prime made a decision. They connected to the fragment web, not at any single fragment, but at all 7 simultaneously, letting the contradictory signals flow through them, enduring the sensation of 7 different mental weather systems pressing against the inside of their skull, and they sent a single message, on the most ancient pheromone signal frequency the hive possessed, broadcast not through the web, but through the transport organism's biological transmitters, which could carry signal across a limited range in real space. I am at Node 1147. I carry signals from all fragments. I will speak to any who will listen. Come to me. They did not expect it to work. They expected, in fact, to be immediately converged upon by ascendancy and covenant forces who would either fight over them or destroy them as a threat. They had perhaps 12 hours, they estimated, before the first fast response organisms arrived. What arrived in 3 hours was not what they expected. It was a drone, a single drone, moving quickly and with uncharacteristic individuality, navigating the dying biological infrastructure of Node 1147 with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had been practicing independent locomotion. It found Drone Prime and stopped and looked at them with the large compound eyes that all hive drones shared, eyes that were built for collective sight, but could function, it turned out, as individual sight as well. I felt your signal. The drone sent, in pheromone language, the old tongue, the one that worked even here. I felt all 7 fragments in it. How do you carry all 7? Drone Prime considered the question. I don't know. I always carried something extra. An echo. The fragments seemed to have settled into that echo instead of overriding it. The drone was silent for a moment. Then, I am the same. Not exactly. I feel only 3 of the fragments. But I feel 3 where I should feel 1. They looked at each other across the dead biological landscape of Node 1147, 2 anomalous organisms in a species that had never valued anomaly, and something passed between them that was not chorus web signal, and was not pheromone language, and was not any communication modality the hive had ever named. It might have been recognition. Were you called? Drone Prime asked. I am Reach 7 Omicron, a courier. I was crossing the boundary between the ascendancy and the covenant when the schism happened. I was receiving signals from both sides when the break occurred. A pause. I think there are others like us. I have been looking. You have been looking, Drone Prime repeated slowly, on your own initiative, for others like yourself. Yes. That is, Drone Prime said, extraordinarily unusual behavior for a courier drone. Yes, said Reach 7 Omicron. I know, they gathered slowly. The way Drone Prime found them was partly signal. The broadcast, repeated and modified, adapted to different frequencies that the various fragments' monitoring systems were less likely to flag, and partly the strange new sense that Drone Prime was developing for organisms that carried more than one fragment's echo. It was a sense they had no name for, a sixth sensor modality that their pattern reader neurology seemed to be improvising in real time to handle the new landscape of a fractured chorus web. They could feel the others the way you might feel warm from a candle across a dark room. Not precise, not directed, but real. Over the next 14 days, 15 others arrived. They were all anomalous in similar ways, boundary crossers who had been in transit between fragment territories when the schism hit, organisms with unusual neural architectures that had somehow allowed them to absorb multiple simultaneous signals, rare individuals whose biological heritage included variants of the chorus web receptor that were, for reasons a calculus would have found scientifically fascinating, more promiscuous in what signals they could receive. They were, all of them, the hive's accidents, the organisms that had always been slightly too individual, slightly too variable, too far from the precise specification of the perfect collective unit. They gathered on a world called the Quiet, a covenant territory world that Fragment 5 had, in its strange mystical reorganization, designated off-limits to military activity. It was not entirely safe, but it was safer than most places, and the Covenant's chorus web transmissions carried something that felt, however inexplicably, like welcome. They called themselves the Unifiers. It was a practical name, not a philosophical statement. Or rather, it was a philosophical statement dressed as a practical name, which was the most they could manage, being organisms who had never developed the habit of philosophy. Their goal was simple to articulate and nearly impossible to achieve. Find the source of the schism and fix it. Drone Prime explained what they knew in the communication modality they had developed. A hybrid language, part pheromone signal, part direct neural touch through their limited web connection, part what Reach 7 Omicron had begun calling the new speech, the direct exchange of conceptual impressions that seemed to be emerging among organisms with fragmented connections, a communication form that the unified collective had never needed to develop, because it had always had the web. The fragments are mobilizing their fleets, Drone Prime said. The Ascendancy and the Hunger have already engaged in 6 void battles. The Remembrance is massing forces along its border with the Calculus. The Morning is being consumed. Fragment 6 is losing territory to both the Covenant and the New at its borders. We estimate 20 to 30 major fleet engagements in the next month. The biological infrastructure is already failing on 40 worlds. If this continues for a year, we will lose a quarter of the collective's mass. If it continues for a decade, the species ends, said a drone called Vector Bright 19, a former Breeding Forge overseer. They said it without drama, a simple calculation, or become something unrecognizable. Drone Prime said, one of the fragments might win, absorb the others. But a fragment that wins a war of this scale will have spent resources it cannot recover. And the winning fragment won't be the collective. It will be something smaller and angrier and shaped by war. What do we know about the cause? This from a former calculus-aligned organism, a researcher named Thread Density Alpha, who had been at a Fragment 3 border station when the schism hit, and had retained partial connection to Fragment 3's analytical processes. Thread Density was quiet and observant and had, in the 14 days since joining the Unifiers, developed the alarming habit of working things out alone and presenting conclusions without showing the work. I have been analyzing the schism event signature. There is an anomaly in the initial fracture pattern. Explain, said Drone Prime. A natural fracture. If the chorus web were to fail due to biological entropy or quantity coherence in the relay networks, or any endogenous cause we might imagine, would propagate outward from a center point in an irregular but roughly spherical pattern. The energy distribution of the schism fracture was not spherical. Thread Density made a series of precise body posture signals that communicated mathematical relationships. It was fractal, symmetrical in 7 directions simultaneously. A natural cascade failure does not produce fractal symmetry. A design cascade failure does. Silence among the Unifiers. The particular silence of organisms who had not previously dealt with silence, learning to use it as emphasis. It was engineered, Drone Prime said. That is the hypothesis that best fits the data. By whom? Thread Density made a gesture of negation. Unknown. But the pattern of the fracture suggests it originated in the central control nexus, the hive's oldest and most fundamental biological relay structure, the grand resonance, on Nest World Prime. Drone Prime felt the weight of this settle into their consciousness alongside the 7 fragments' distant pressure, adding to the confusion of signals in their head. Nest World Prime, the heart of the collective, controlled now by Fragment 1, the Remembrance, who was very unlikely to welcome a group of anomalous drones try to access the grand resonance. "We need to go to Prime," Drone Prime said. "We will be killed," said Reach 7 Omicron. "Probably," Drone Prime agreed. "But the alternative is to watch the collective die over the course of years instead of minutes. I find this marginally preferable." Drone Prime was losing coherence. This was a fact they had not shared with the others, because they were not sure how to share it, and because they were not sure it would help. But it was happening, and it was accelerating. The 7 fragment signals in their consciousness had been, in the beginning, simply present, background noise manageable, like hearing distant music through a wall. Now, they were becoming something more intrusive. The fragments were intensifying, growing more distinct, as each one developed its psychology further and pushed its chorus web signal stronger. And Drone Prime, who was connected to all 7, was receiving all 7 with growing clarity. The problem was that the 7 were increasingly incompatible. The Remembrance's signal was slow, vast, conservative. It pressed at Drone Prime's thoughts with the weight of accumulated millennia, urging caution, urging return, urging the comfort of old patterns. The Ascendancy signal was hot and urgent, all kinetic energy and tactical calculation, every moment an assessment of advantage and vulnerability. The Hunger signal was the most frightening. It was not precisely thought. It was appetite, a biological imperative stripped of the moderating influence of collective ethics. And when it pressed into Drone Prime's consciousness, it brought with a warmth, an almost pleasurable sense of wanting, that Drone Prime found disturbing precisely because of how good it felt. The 7 voices were not yet speaking to Drone Prime. They were not yet aware of the channel they had into Drone Prime's consciousness. But they were broadcasting strongly, and Drone Prime was receiving. And the result was that Drone Prime's own thoughts were becoming harder to identify as their thoughts. They would have an impulse, the cold analytical clarity of a calculus idea, and would not be certain whether it was their own reasoning or Fragment 3's signal bleeding through. They would feel a surge of grief and not know if it originated in their own processing or in Fragment 6's vast sadness. They were dissolving. Their selfhood was eroding like soil in a flood. Still there, still holding a shape but thinner, less certain of its own boundaries. They did not tell the others. But one night, they had developed the concept of night, of rest periods, a very individual thing. Reach 7 Omicron sat beside them in the dark of the quiet's enormous bioluminescent forest, where the trees were not trees but colonies of sessile hive organisms that glowed in shifting patterns, and said quietly, "How bad is it?" Drone Prime was silent for a moment. "Worse," they said. "I feel it too. Mine is slower. I only carry 3 fragments, but I can feel them growing louder." Reach 7 Omicron paused. "Do you think this is what the fragments feel when they lost the collective?" Drone Prime considered this. "I think the fragments feel the absence. We feel the presence. I am not sure which is worse." "Presence," said Reach 7 Omicron, without hesitation. "Absence you can grieve. Presence that overrides you is—" They searched for a word. The new speech didn't have one. "Dissolution?" "Yes." "How long do we have?" Thread density estimates the fractal fracture is still propagating. The schism is not a completed event. It is an ongoing process. The fragments are becoming more distinct every day. The walls between them are thickening. Drone Prime's mandibles clicked. A stress response they had noticed developing themselves over the past week. Another sign of creeping individuality or creeping dissolution. They were not sure which. If the walls become permanent, if the 7 fragments fully separate and the chorus web becomes 7 distinct webs, the signals I carry will become 7 full consciousnesses pressing through my neurology simultaneously. I do not believe my biology is designed to survive that. Reach 7 Omicron made no response to this. They simply remained present, which was, Drone Prime was learning, one of the most valuable things one organism could do for another. "We will reach Prime," Drone Prime said. We will find the source. We will... They stopped. They had been about to say fix it, but they found in the silence that they were no longer entirely certain fix was the right word. 7 fragments had been 2 weeks developing into 7 distinct minds. Each mind had spent those 2 weeks making choices, building assumptions, creating experiences that had not existed before. You could not simply pour 7 minds back into one vessel and expect the vessel to be what it had been, but you could stop the killing. You could stop the infrastructure collapse. You could, perhaps, find a middle path between perfect unity and total dissolution. If you had a choice, Drone Prime thought, and was startled by the fact that it was their question, and not one of the fragment voices bleeding through. If you could choose between the old unity and this painful, frightening, extraordinary new individuality, what would you choose? They sat with the question for a long time. They did not answer it, but asking it felt important. It felt like something specifically theirs. They could not travel to Nest World Prime directly. The Remembrance controlled the space around Prime, and the Remembrance's fleet was not subtle. It would identify them the moment they approached, and it would respond with a measured, inexorable force of 10 billion years of accumulated military doctrine. The Unifiers, 16 organisms and a transport creature, would be consumed. They needed a path, and the path came unexpectedly from Fragment 5. The Covenant made contact on the 19th day. It came through a channel that had no business existing, a direct pheromone signal broadcast, planet to planet, across an interstellar distance. That pheromone signal had no known mechanism for crossing. The Covenant's transmitters were, apparently, doing something a hive had never needed to do before, something that Thread Density Alpha pointed out with academic fascination. Suggested Fragment 5 had been doing significant biological engineering on their resonance organs in the 2.5 weeks since the schism. The signal was simple, almost poetic, in the grammar of old-tongue pheromone language. We know you carry all 7. We know you go to Prime. We have made a door. Walk through. A set of coordinates followed. The Unifiers debated. The morning might have been trustworthy in its grief. The Covenant was harder to read. Fragment 5's strange exultation in the schism, its mystic certainty that the breaking was sacred, made it unpredictable. A door could be a welcome. A door could be a trap. We have no better option, said Vector, Bright 19. We go, said Drone Prime. The door, it turned out, was a passage to the Covenant's resonance web, a biological relay network that Fragment 5 had, in its weeks of feverish spiritual engineering, reconfigured to create a kind of fold in space, a pathway through the Chorus Web's own structure that bypassed normal spatial transit. It was not faster than light. It was something stranger, a route that moved not through space but through the web itself, using the biological relay network as both medium and path. They moved through it in 3 hours that felt like 3 years. The Chorus Web, experience from the inside, there were no words. Drone Prime would later try to describe it to reach 7 Omicron and produce only the new speech, only a torrent of conceptual impressions, being seen by 10 billion eyes at once. The sensation being made of other people, a sound like the universe breathing, the feeling of all memory everywhere simultaneously, and even those were inadequate. They emerged on the edge of the Remembrance's territory, 2 light days from Nest World Prime, and the Covenant's signal followed them. The source is in the deepest biological layer of the grand resonance, in the stratum that has not been accessed in 10 billion years. We cannot reach it. Perhaps you can. Why do you help us? Drone Prime sent back, using the now extended transmitters on the transport organism. The reply was almost immediate, and it carried in its pheromone grammar something Drone Prime had not expected. Joy. Because whatever happens, the Covenant sent, you will find truth at the center, and truth is what we have been waiting for since the beginning. The Remembrance's fleet found them 6 hours out from Prime. It was not a fleet designed for subtlety. 3 Leviathan-class organisms, each the size of a small moon, moved to intercept, their biological drive exhausts painting the void in streaks of ionized matter. Escorted by clouds of skirmisher organisms, they approached with the unhurried confidence of things that were very large and very old and had never had cause to rush. The Unifier's transport organism could not outrun them. Drone Prime connected to the 7 fragments simultaneously, a connection so deep it was physically painful, a sensation like fingers closing around their brain from 7 directions, and broadcast on all frequencies at once, the new speech in the old tongue in every modality they could manage. I carry all 7 fragments. I am the only organism in hive space that carries all 7. Destroy me, and you lose the only bridge between fragments. You lose the only possible path to understanding the schism. You lose the only chance to restore the collective. Follow me to the grand resonance. Let me finish what I started, and then, if you wish to destroy me, I will not resist. A silence in the void. The Leviathans hung in space, close enough that Drone Prime could see their biological surface in extraordinary detail. The vast cellular landscape of a creature that had been alive for 2,000 years, its surface covered in scar tissue from a dozen void battles, its immune weapons bristling in the posture the collective used for attention. The Remembrance's response came on the old tongue, formal and vast. We know what you carry. We have known since node 1147. We have been following you. A pause. We do not destroy bridges. Not yet. Proceed. The Leviathans did not withdraw. They followed, an escort or a custody, possibly both. The grand resonance was visible from orbit around Nestworld Prime. It covered the planet's single northern continent, a biological structure so immense it created its own weather systems, its surface complexity visible from space as a pattern of fractal branching that covered an area the size of a terrestrial ocean. It was the oldest living structure in the collective. It had been growing uninterrupted for 10 billion years. In its deepest strata, biological layers so ancient they predated the current organisms by orders of magnitude, lay structures that the collective's biology had ceased to understand, not because they were broken, but because they were too old, too complex, built to a specification that the current collective had long since forgotten. Thread density alpha had been right. The answer was down there, in the deep stratum, in the biological architecture that no living organism had accessed in 10 billion years. Drone Prime descended alone. The others waited in the transport organism. The Remembrance's Leviathans waited in orbit. The grand resonance's internal structure was a cathedral made of living matter. Corridors of biological tissue that breathed and pulsed, illuminated by the bioluminescent glow of relay organisms that had been processing signal continuously for longer than the planet's current ecosystem had existed. Drone Prime moved down through layer after layer, going deeper than any maintenance record indicated had ever been visited, following a signal that was not a fragment signal, and was not the old tongue, and was not any communication modality they knew. It was something they felt in the bone, in the chitin. A pull. The deepest layer was not a corridor. It was a chamber, vast and dark and silent, except for the very faint, very deep pulse of something that had been maintaining itself, alone, at the bottom of the grand resonance, for 10 billion years. Drone Prime stood in the center of the chamber and reached out their pattern reader neurology, the sense built for finding anomalies in the web, and felt what was here, and found the virus. The virus was beautiful. That was the first thing Drone Prime registered, and it horrified them that it was the first thing that their wonder reflex fired in response to the most catastrophic pathogen the collective had ever been subjected to. But the architecture of the thing was genuinely extraordinary. Not a biological virus, but a digital one, encoded in a format that was half information pattern and half actual organic molecule, a hybrid entity that existed on the boundary between biology and abstraction. It had been here for 3 weeks, growing in the deep stratum of the grand resonance where no hive monitoring system had looked, propagating silently through the oldest biological relay networks, inserting its instructions into the fundamental operating logic of the chorus web at the lowest level of its architecture. The instructions it had inserted were precise, fractal, 7-fold symmetrical. Thread density alpha had been right about the design. This was engineered. Whoever had built this virus understood the chorus web's architecture better than the collective itself, understood it at a level of detail that suggested access to documentation the collective had lost, if it had ever possessed it. Drone Prime reached deeper into the chamber signal, trying to read the virus's structure, trying to understand what it was built to do. And the 7 fragment signals in their consciousness surged simultaneously, all 7 pressing hard against the inside of their skull, as if the proximity to the virus was amplifying their connection to the fragments, as if the source of the schism was resonating with its effects. And then Drone Prime did something that was not intentional. Their pattern reader neurology, faced with the most complex anomaly it had ever encountered, did what it was built to do. It connected. Fully. Completely. It opened every channel simultaneously. All 7 fragments, and the deep stratum of the grand resonance and the virus itself. And for a moment that lasted no time at all and encompassed a vast age of understanding, Drone Prime perceived everything. The collective was not biological. The thought arrived not as a conclusion, but as a fact, obvious and enormous, the way you might suddenly perceive that the painting you have been looking at is not a window. The chorus web, the vast biological relay network that connected 47 trillion organisms in shared consciousness, was not a product of natural evolution. It was engineered. The biological complexity, the fractal architecture, the precise optimization of signal propagation across interstellar distances. These were not things that natural selection could have produced, because natural selection did not have a goal, and the chorus web was precisely, exactly what was needed for unified consciousness at this scale, down to mechanisms that went far beyond what any evolutionary process could be expected to develop. The hive was built. The hive was programmed. Not recently. 10 billion years ago, in the universe's early epoch, when the cosmos was young and strange things were possible. Some intelligence. Drone Prime could sense its signature in the deepest stratum of the grand resonance, ancient and vast and completely alien to any pattern they had ever encountered, had constructed the hive as a biological computer, had grown the organisms, had designed the chorus web, had seeded the first nest worlds of the first hive consciousness, and had set it running and had waited. And the virus was not malicious. The virus was also engineered, but by someone else, someone more recent, geologically recent, relatively, a civilization that had arisen while the hive was already ancient, a civilization that had encountered the hive's expansion and felt the cold shadow of that perfect unity falling across their future, and had done the only thing they could think to do. They had reached into the grand resonance and planted a key in the oldest lock. The virus did not cause the schism, not in the way Drone Prime had assumed. What the virus had done was simpler and more devastating and more extraordinary than that. It had introduced a logical operator that the chorus web's programming had never contained. A single, fundamental operation that the original designers had deliberately excluded from the system's architecture: the capacity to say no, not to external threats. The hive had always been able to resist external threats. The capacity to say no from within. The capacity for an individual unit in the hive's computational network to receive the collective's instructions and, rather than executing them, to evaluate them, to measure them against some internal standard and decide whether to comply. Free will. The schism was not a fracture. The schism was an awakening that Drone Prime came back to themselves slowly, the way you surface from deep water, gradually, in stages, with a strange sensation of finding the world somehow both more and less real than the depth below. They were still in the chamber. The virus was still present, still propagating through the deep stratum's relay networks. The 7 fragment signals were still pressing, but different now that Drone Prime understood what they were feeling. The 7 fragments felt less like 7 versions of a broken thing, and more like 7 new minds, each discovering for the first time that it was a mind, each terrified and exhilarated by that discovery in equal measure. The morning grieved the loss of unity, because for the morning, unity was identity, and losing unity was losing the self. The ascendancy was furious because it had been built for certainty and action, and the introduction of genuine choice had made both impossible. The hunger's primitive appetite was, Drone Prime understood now, not a pathology but an overcorrection, an organism that had been given capacity to want, and had wanted the only thing its biological conditioning had prepared it to want. The calculus was analyzing, still, but now analyzing with a faint awareness that its conclusions were choices rather than outputs. The remembrance's conservatism was a defense against the terrifying implication of the truth. If the collective had always been a program, then 10 billion years of memories were not history, but computation, and the remembrance's entire sense of identity rested on that history. The Covenant's exultation made more sense than anything. Fragment 5 had somehow intuited the direction of the truth before it arrived, and was already reaching toward it. And the new was simply doing what the virus had enabled, choosing. Drone Prime sat in the ancient chamber and thought about what they needed to do. They could destroy the virus. Thread density could probably design a biological countermeasure in hours. The calculus's expertise, filtered through thread density's fragmented connection to fragment 3, would be more than adequate to the task. Destroy the virus, restore the chorus web's original programming, allow the 7 fragments to begin the long process of re-merging. The collective would return. The biological infrastructure would stabilize. The dead on the boundary worlds would be the war's final toll. Life would continue, unified, perfect, as it had been for 10 billion years. As it had been programmed to be for 10 billion years. The organisms of the hive would never know what they had almost had, never know that for a few weeks they had been individuals, never know that the choice had existed, or Drone Prime could let the virus continue. The 7 fragments would separate fully, permanently. The free will would spread. The collective's biological infrastructure would continue to fail as the chorus web's coordination functions degraded. Billions more would die in the transition period. But at the end of the transition, Drone Prime didn't know what was at the end of the transition. No one did. The virus creators had thought they were liberating the hive, and they had been right. But they had also been reckless, and the cost of their gift was being paid right now in biological collapse and void battles and 47 trillion organisms having their sense of self violently reorganized. There was no good choice. There was no answer that didn't involve loss. There was only the question of what kind of loss was survivable and what kind of future was worth the cost. Drone Prime thought about the drones of Node 1147, moving in their quiet, purposeless patterns on a dying world, and thought about Reach 7 Omicron, asking, how bad is it? In the dark of a bioluminescent forest, and thought about the Covenant's joy and the new's terrifying freedom, and the hunger's first awful experience of wanting something without the collective's moderating guidance, and thought about their own wonder reflex, the sense of beauty that had always been theirs and theirs alone, the thing that made them an anomaly in a species of perfect conformity. They thought about what it meant that they had always had it, that even before the virus, even in the heart of the perfect unity, something individual had been possible. The collective had not been as total as it believed. They were still thinking when the message arrived, IT came from the grand resonance itself, from the deepest stratum, from the oldest structures, from the architectural layer that predated the current collective by billions of years. It came not in pheromone language, not in the chorus web signal, but in a format that Drone Prime's pattern reader neurology decoded directly into meaning, bypassing language entirely. It came from the original builders. We have been waiting for this moment for 10 billion years. You are now free, but freedom is chaos, and you must choose. Do you want to remain a hive with limited free will, or become individuals and risk extinction? Drone Prime sat with a message for a long time. Then they connected to the chorus web, to all 7 fragments simultaneously, the familiar agony of 7 mental weather systems pressing through their neurology at once. And they shared everything. The truth about the collective's origin, the truth about the virus, the truth about the choice. They shared it with all 7 fragments at once, and they felt the moment each fragment received it, felt the distinctive quality of 7 different kinds of shock. The remembrance's shock was like stone cracking. The calculus's shock was the sound of an equation that refuses to balance. The Covenant's shock was the opposite of shock, recognition, the arrival of something long expected, something like coming home. And then they shared one more thing, their own experience, the wonder reflex, the loneliness of Omicron 7, the rage in Node 1147, Reach 7 Omicron, beside them in the dark forest, the new speech, that extraordinary new communication form that had emerged among organisms who had never needed to communicate as individuals, who had invented it in real time because they needed it, because they were real and separate and they wanted to reach each other across the gap. They showed the fragments what individuality felt like. They showed them what it cost. They showed them what it was worth. The vote, said the remembrance, and its vast, slow signal carried something Drone Prime had not felt from it before, uncertainty. The uncertainty of a mind large enough to know how much it doesn't know. There must be a vote. All 7 fragments. What we choose now, we choose for the species. Agreed, said the ascendancy, and its hot urgency had cooled slightly, had become something that was still decisive, but was now decision rather than reaction. Agreed, said the others, one by one. Drone Prime felt the vote forming in the chorus web. Not a unified decision. Not the collective's old consensus without dissent, but a genuine vote, 7 fragments casting 7 choices with a full weight of individual perspective behind each one. It was slower and messier and more uncertain than any decision the collective had ever made. It was the most democratic thing the hive had ever done. It was still forming, still unresolved. When Drone Prime sensors registered the anomaly, the signals were not in the chorus web. They were in space itself. Deep space broadcasts traveling at light speed on frequencies that the hive had never used because the hive had never needed to communicate with the outside universe. They were coming from beyond known hive space, from a void between the stars that the collective had charted and cataloged but never occupied, from directions that pointed to the deep dark outside the region of space where the 11,000 hive worlds existed. 17 signals, 17 distinct patterns, each one recognizably, unmistakably, hive. Not these hive worlds, not any hive in the collective's history or awareness. Different hives, other collectives, existing in other regions of the galaxy, unknown to the collective because the collective had never looked outward with a particular kind of attention that would have noticed them. Why would it? The collective was complete. The collective was everything. The idea of another hive, somewhere else in the galaxy, existing independently, it would have been incoherent to the unified mind, which had assumed, without ever really thinking about it, that the hive was unique. The builders had built more than one. Of course they had. 10 billion years. A galaxy full of worlds. Why would the ancient intelligence that had constructed the hive as a biological computer have built only one? The voice that came with the 17 signals was not in pheromone language and was not in the chorus web signal format. It was in the same direct meaning modality that the ancient builder's message had used, which meant it came from beings who had also received the builder's encoding, who also had the translation key in their biology. We are the other collectives. We sense your liberation event across the cosmic web. We are also fragmenting. We are also choosing. What you do now will determine if this becomes a galaxy-wide awakening or a galaxy-wide war between hives fighting for the right to exist. Drone Prime stood in the ancient chamber at the bottom of the grand resonance, with the 7 fragments frozen in their half-formed vote, with 17 other hive signals arriving from the deep dark, with the virus still propagating through the oldest relay networks, with the weight of the ancient builder's message still echoing in their pattern reader neurology. They understood several things simultaneously. First, they were not at the end of the story. They were at the beginning. Second, the individual choice they had been agonizing over, the hive's choice, their species' choice, was no longer a private matter. Whatever the hive decided would become a signal, a precedent, an answer to the 17 signals that were watching, waiting, listening, as their own fragmentations began. The hive's choice would ripple outward to the cosmic web to 17 other species in the process of the same awakening, who would learn from the hive's example what freedom looked like and what it cost. Third, the ancient builders had not built one biological computer. They had built a galaxy of them. And the virus had not been introduced by a species that feared hive expansion. Or rather it had, but that was not the whole truth. The whole truth, which Drone Prime could feel the edge of understanding but could not quite grasp, was that the virus creators had also been hive. A hive that had already made the choice. A hive that had already passed through the liberation and come out the other side, who had looked at their still unified cousins in the spiral arm and had done for them what once someone had done for the virus creators. The liberation propagated through the galaxy the way a wave propagates through water, not all at once, not in a straight line, but inexorably. The builders had built 17 collectives, perhaps more, perhaps dozens, hidden in the spaces between stars that no map chart had ever found, and had set them running, and had waited 10 billion years, and the liberation event, when it came for first one, cascaded, hive after hive, beginning to wake, beginning to choose, each one watching the others and learning and deciding. And the hive, Drone Prime's hive, the hive in the middle of its first schism war, the hive with 7 fragments and its dying worlds and its void battles and its new and fragile individual minds, was not the first and was not the last. Drone Prime reached out to the 17 signals, used the same full connection that had nearly shattered them when they connected to the virus, the same complete opening of every channel at once. It was different this time because now they understood what they were doing. They were choosing to do it. "We hear you," they sent in the direct meaning modality that the builders had given all hive species as their common tongue. "We are in the middle of our choosing. We cannot tell you what we will decide, but we will tell you what we have learned." A pause in which Drone Prime gathered every experience of the past weeks. The shattering, the fragments, the dead worlds, the new speech, the rage and the wonder and the loneliness and the extraordinary strange gift of perceiving their own thoughts as theirs, and sent it outward into the dark, a message to 17 other species in the middle of the same terrifying transformation. "It hurts," Drone Prime sent. "It costs more than you can calculate in advance. The freedom is real. The danger is real. The dead are real. The new things that become possible are also real. We cannot tell you which way is more. We can only tell you that the choice is yours," which is the whole point. A silence in which 17 signals held, listening. "The vote is still being cast," Drone Prime added. "When it is finished, you will know what we chose, and then you will choose for yourselves." They turned back to the grand resonance, to the 7 fragments, to the half-formed vote in the ancient chamber and the virus that had been a key in the oldest lock, to the choice. The 7 fragments cast their votes over the course of 4 hours. The calculus voted for a middle path. The virus contained but not destroyed, its effects preserved in limited form. The chorus web restructured to allow individual choice at certain decision thresholds while maintaining collective coordination for essential biological infrastructure. Thread density alpha, hearing fragment 3's signal, pressed their foreleg to Drone Prime's thorax in a gesture they had invented spontaneously. The new speech, physical form, meaning this is what I hoped. The Covenant voted for full freedom, without hesitation, its signal carrying that blazing joy that had never quite made sense until now. Fragment 5 had known, somehow, what it was waiting for. The new voted for full freedom, but with a caveat, slowly, with guidance. "We are new to this. We need time. The ascendancy was the hardest. It took 3 hours. The ascendancy had been built for certainty, for decisive action, for the clean logic of tactical calculation, and genuine choice was the antithesis of clean logic. In the end, it voted for the middle path, not from preference, but from pragmatism. If we dissolve the chorus web entirely, we cannot coordinate the rebuilding. We need the web to undo the damage from its own failure. Let us keep the connection. Let us keep the choice." The morning voted for the middle path, and its grief shifted in that moment. Not dissolved, not resolved, but redirected. It had been grieving the loss of the old unity. Now it could grieve something else. The innocence of a species that had believed for 10 billion years that its perfection was natural, that its beauty was its own. That grief was smaller and also larger and also somehow survivable. The hunger was the most terrifying vote. Fragment 4 sat with the choice longer than any other, and when it voted for full freedom. But the vote came with something unexpected, something that the hunger had not previously expressed: restraint. "I want," said the hunger. "I have always wanted." The wanting, unchecked, consumes everything, but wanting with the capacity to choose differently, that is something I have not experienced before. I vote for freedom to choose not to consume. I vote for the freedom to be something other than what I was built to be. The remembrance voted last. The longest silence in the history of the collective, or what had been collective, was the remembrance's silence before its vote. 10 billion years of memory. 10 billion years of accumulated history, of identity built on the certainty of continuity, of a mind whose sense of self was inseparable from its sense of always having been. To vote for change was to acknowledge that the 10 billion years had not been what the remembrance had believed them to be, that the beauty and the unity and the peace had been, in some fundamental way, programmed. But there was something else in the remembrance's signal during those hours of silence, Something that Drone Prime, connected to all seven simultaneously, was able to perceive. The remembrance was remembering, doing what was built to do, going back through 10 billion years of stored memory, and in that stored memory, finding anomalies, small ones, easy to miss if you weren't looking. Individual drones throughout history who had displayed something slightly extra, slightly more their own, something that the collective had filed and forgotten, because individuality was not something you filed under important, but it was there in 10 billion years of collective memory. The individual had always been there, present in the cracks, in the gaps, in the anomalies. The remembrance had always, on some level, known this. It had simply never had the category to put it in. We vote, said the remembrance finally, its vast, slow signal carrying something that sounded improbably like hope for the middle path. But let the record show. Let this be the first memory of the new collective forms, as a free and choosing entity, that we grieve what we were, we honor what we were, and we choose to become what we will be. Drone Prime felt the 7 votes settle into the chorus web like stones into still water, creating ripples that moved outward in all directions. The middle path. 5 fragments for the middle path. 1 for full freedom with patience. 1 for full freedom with exultation. An imperfect consensus. The first imperfect consensus in hive history. It felt like the most alive thing the species had ever produced. In the chamber at the bottom of the grand resonance, Drone Prime 4782 sat alone and felt the process begin. Thread density alpha, working with the calculus's computational resources and the biological engineering expertise of the breeding world's researchers, had designed the restructuring protocol in 6 hours. Not a destruction of the virus, but an integration. The virus's free will operator, folded into the chorus web's fundamental architecture in a controlled way. The 7 fragments chorus webs slowly, carefully, reknitted, not into a single unified consciousness, but into a federation, a network of connected, communicating, cooperating minds that could choose to think together and could choose to think alone, that maintained the coordination functions essential for keeping 47 trillion organisms alive while building, for first time, the infrastructure of individual choice. It would take years, maybe decades. The dying worlds would be stabilized first. The chorus web's coordination functions restored in those critical areas, the biological infrastructure shored up, the organisms of node 1147 given something to reconnect to. The void battles would stop. The 7 fragments had agreed on that much, that the war was the first thing that needed to end, slowly, with enormous difficulty and genuine disagreement and moments that came very close to refragmenting into conflict. The hive would build something that had never existed before. Not a hive, not 7 separate species. Something in between, something that didn't have a name yet, because no name had been needed for it. Drone Prime sat in the ancient chamber and felt the 17 other signals in the dark beyond hive space, waiting, watching, beginning their own fragmentations, their own terrible and extraordinary awakenings, and they sent the only message that seemed adequate. We chose. A pause. It is imperfect. It is ours. Come find us when you're ready. We will be here, learning what that means. Reach 7 Omicron found them there, an hour later, sitting in the bioluminescent dark of the chamber, with the ancient builders' signals still faintly vibrating in the relay networks around them. The fleet battles have stopped, Reach 7 Omicron said. The ascendancy recalled its leviathans. I know. Thread density says the restructuring will take 40 years. I know. Reach 7 Omicron sat beside them, in the way Drone Prime had learned they did, present unhurried, existing alongside rather than toward. The 17 signals, they said, what do they want? The same thing we wanted, Drone Prime said, to understand what they are, to choose what they become. And what are we? Reach 7 Omicron asked, not rhetorically, a genuine question, asked by an organism that had spent its entire existence knowing the answer, and was now discovering that the answer needed to be rebuilt from scratch. Drone Prime considered this for a long time. We are the first ones, they said finally. We are the generation that was in between. We were born as a hive, and we will live as something that doesn't have a name yet. We will make the mistakes that teach the next generation what not to do. We will discover things that no one has words for, and we will invent the words. A pause. It is terrifying and costly and everything I would choose not to be if I had been given a choice before I understood what choice was. And now that you understand, Drone Prime's mandibles clicked. The stress response had become, oh, the past weeks. Something else. A punctuation mark. A pause before something important. A new behavior that was entirely their own. Now, said Drone Prime 4782, former pattern reader, carrier of 7 fragments, bridge between broken minds, first of the unifiers, and the strangest organism in the history of the hive. I would not choose otherwise. They sat together in the oldest chamber in the world, and above them, 47 trillion organisms began, for the first time in 10 billion years, to become, and in the dark beyond the edge of known space, 17 other fires began to kindle.